The town of Maplewood, tucked between rolling hills and wide stretches of farmland, was not the sort of place people usually associated with scandal. It was a quiet community in the United States, where neighbors still waved from porches, children rode bicycles down cracked sidewalks, and the courthouse sat proudly in the town square like a symbol of law and order. But on this particular morning, Maplewood was anything but calm. Long before the sun had climbed to its peak, people were already gathering outside the courthouse, whispering in hushed voices, clutching coffee cups as if they needed something to steady their nerves. News vans lined the streets, their satellite dishes pointed skyward, while journalists rehearsed their opening reports. Something about this case had gripped the community, and by now was drawing attention across the state. The trial had been called The People versus Raymond Clark, and though Raymond was just a single man, the case represented something much larger, a question of justice, truth, and the vulnerability of those who often had no voice of their own. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Lawyers shuffled papers, adjusting their notes, while the prosecution prepared their opening statements. The defense lawyers sat quietly but confidently, exchanging glances that suggested they had little to fear. Court officials moved briskly through the room, reminding everyone to maintain order, though their own expressions betrayed how extraordinary this day felt. At the very center of all this tension was not the defendant, nor the lawyers, nor the stern-faced judge seated at his high bench. Instead, it was a child, a 3-year-old toddler, small enough that her feet barely touched the ground when she sat in a chair. Her presence in the trial had already sparked fierce debate. Some argued she was too young to understand what she had witnessed. Others believed her innocence made her the most credible voice in the entire case. Regardless of opinion, the fact remained. Her testimony was crucial. Without it, much of the prosecution's argument would falter. The judge himself had wrestled with the decision. Allowing a toddler to testify was rare, risky even. But in the absence of clear adult witnesses, her words might provide the missing link that could tip the scales of justice. Sometimes, he had told the court during preliminary hearings, truth comes from the most unexpected sources. And so, the little girl's name appeared on the witness list. As the trial began, whispers echoed across the wooden benches. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads, already drafting headlines. Can a toddler testify? Justice in the words of a child? The entire courtroom seemed divided between doubt and curiosity. The defendant, Raymond Clark, sat at the defense table, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed forward. He had been accused of domestic violence, with his partner now hospitalized, too terrified to take the stand herself. The child was the only person who had seen it all unfold. The thought of her testifying against him seemed almost absurd, and yet it terrified him. He drummed his fingers against the table, his jaw tight. For the prosecution, the stakes were immense. They had evidence, photographs, and medical reports, but without the child's account, it was all circumstantial. They needed her words. They needed her truth. The jury, 12 ordinary citizens, looked on with mixed emotions. Some wore skeptical expressions, silently questioning whether a toddler could even understand the meaning of truth and lies. Others leaned forward with interest, sensing the gravity of what was about to happen. Each of them knew they would have to decide not only on the guilt or innocence of the man before them, but also on whether they believed the soft, unpracticed voice of a child. The judge struck his gavel, and the courtroom fell silent. His words rang clear. We are here today to seek truth and justice. The court will proceed with the understanding that every voice, no matter how small, deserves to be heard. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, touched by the sentiment. Others shook their heads, muttering that this was a mistake. And then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The doors at the side of the courtroom creaked open. All eyes turned. She entered the room slowly, holding tightly to the hand of a court officer. Her other hand clutched a worn stuffed rabbit, its ear dangling by a thread. She wore a little yellow dress, the kind that swayed around her knees when she walked, and tiny white shoes that clicked softly against the polished floor. Her hair was tied up in uneven pigtails, and her wide eyes scanned the unfamiliar faces staring at her. The courtroom, once buzzing with tension, seemed to freeze in time. The sight of her innocence walking into such a harsh space struck everyone differently. Some jurors softened instantly, reminded of their own children or grandchildren. Others stiffened, unprepared for the responsibility of weighing her words. Even the journalists, seasoned in covering trials, found themselves lowering their pens for a moment, stunned by the gravity of the scene. The judge's voice softened as he spoke directly to her. "Good morning, sweetheart. Would you like to sit in this chair?" He gestured toward the witness stand, his tone unlike the firm authority he had used moments earlier. But the child clung tighter to her rabbit, shaking her head. Her lip trembled. For a moment, it seemed as though the doubts were correct, that this little girl was too small, too frightened to play any part in the trial. The defense lawyer smirked, certain that the case was already unraveling in their favor. Then, in a quiet but decisive move, the bailiff opened another door. A German shepherd padded into the room, its sleek fur shining under the lights, its demeanor calm and composed. This was Max, a therapy police dog trained to comfort vulnerable witnesses. He had worked in many cases before, sitting beside victims of trauma, offering silent support with his steady presence. The child's eyes lit up the moment she saw him. She let go of the officer's hand and walked quickly to the dog, wrapping her arms around his neck. The courtroom released a collective breath, as if watching the first spark of hope. With Max beside her, she climbed into the witness chair. Her rabbit sat in her lap, Max lay at her feet, and for the first time, she looked less afraid. The defense lawyer rolled his eyes, whispering something to his colleague. The prosecutor, however, straightened with new determination. They all understood that something extraordinary might happen today. The judge, noticing the change in her demeanor, gave a small nod. "We will proceed," he said firmly. And so the stage was set. A courtroom filled with hardened adults, skeptical lawyers, and weary officials was about to witness a moment that would defy all expectations. At the center of it all sat a toddler, a stuffed rabbit, and a loyal police dog, symbols of innocence, comfort, and truth. No one could have predicted what her first words would be, but everyone knew one thing. Whatever she said next could change the course of the entire trial. The courtroom, still buzzing from the child's timid entrance and her sudden connection to Max the police dog, gradually settled into a tense quiet. Everyone present seemed to be holding their breath, watching the little girl's every move. She was so small against the polished oak of the witness stand, her feet swinging above the floor, her stuffed rabbit perched awkwardly on her lap. Judge Henderson, known for his strict and often intimidating presence, leaned slightly forward. His voice softened, as though he had transformed from a stern judge into a grandfather coaxing a frightened child. "Sweetheart," he said gently, "this is Max. He's your friend, and he's going to stay with you. You don't need to be afraid here." The girl didn't respond. She stroked Max's fur, burying her tiny hand in his coat, and leaned her cheek against his head. The dog, as though understanding the weight of the moment, remained perfectly still, only thumping his tail lightly against the wooden floor. Across the room, the jury watched intently. Some leaned forward with compassion, others with skepticism. The sight of such innocence in the middle of a brutal legal battle was jarring. Could a toddler truly offer anything reliable? Or was this entire display complete with stuffed animals and therapy dogs, just a play for sympathy. The prosecutor, Dana Rivers, adjusted her glasses and rose from her chair. Dana had handled difficult cases before, but nothing like this. She carried herself with the resolve of someone who believed in justice. Yet even she felt her stomach tighten as she approached the stand. She knew every move mattered. If she pushed too hard, the child might shut down completely. If she didn't push enough, the jury might dismiss the testimony as meaningless. Dana knelt down to the girl's eye level, careful not to tower over her. "Hi there," she began softly, her voice warm. "Do you remember me? My name's Dana. We talked a little before, remember?" The toddler turned her head slightly, but didn't answer. Her grip on Max tightened, her rabbit pressed against her chest. Dana smiled patiently, as if silence itself was progress. "That's okay. You don't have to talk right now. You're very brave for being here. Do you know why Max is here with you?" Still no answer. Dana glanced at the judge, who gave her a subtle nod to continue. She tried another angle. "Max is here to listen to you. He's very good at keeping secrets. He listens to children all the time. If you want, you can just tell Max what happened. Would you like that?" For the first time, the child's lips parted as though she was about to say something, but then she stopped, shrinking back against the chair. Whispers filled the courtroom. The defense attorney, Mark Stevens, smirked and leaned back in his chair. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for jurors to hear. "She doesn't even know what's going on." The judge shot him a warning look, his gavel tapping once. "Mr. Stevens, you will refrain from commentary." Dana tried again, softer this time. "It's okay if you don't want to talk to me. Maybe Max would like to hear. Can you tell Max your story?" The girl looked down at Max, her small fingers twisting the dog's collar nervously. For a long moment, the silence was unbearable. Journalists scribbled furiously, capturing every pause, every flicker of hesitation. Cameras clicked quietly in the back of the room. And then, barely audible, the child leaned forward, placing her lips near Max's ear. Everyone strained to listen, but her words were too soft. Only Max's handler, Officer Daniels, standing nearby, caught them. His eyes widened slightly. "She's speaking," Daniels announced softly, his voice carrying into the hushed courtroom. The room froze. Jurors leaned forward. Reporters dropped their pens mid-sentence. The prosecutor's breath caught in her throat. "What did she say?" Judge Henderson asked cautiously. Officer Daniels hesitated, as though afraid to shatter the fragile trust that had just been built between child and dog. "She said she wants to tell Max about the bad man." The defendant shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening. The smirk was gone. Gasps rippled through the room. The little girl had not addressed the lawyers, the judge, or even the jury. But she had spoken. She had chosen Max as her confidant, and through him, her truth was about to surface. The prosecutor's heart pounded. She hadn't expected it to work this quickly, but she knew better than to interfere. This was not about her questions. It was about the bond between the child and the dog. Gently, she signaled to Officer Daniels. "Please stay close. Repeat only what she says." The girl whispered again, her eyes fixed on Max, as though no one else existed in the room. Her rabbit tumbled from her lap, forgotten. Her tiny voice quivered, yet it carried an honesty no adult witness could match. "She said," Daniels repeated, "the bad man hurt Mommy. She saw him." The courtroom erupted in gasps. Dana's eyes widened. She had expected it would take hours, if it happened at all, for the child to reveal something. Yet here it was, simple, clear, and devastatingly direct. The defense attorney sprang to his feet. "Objection," he barked. "This is completely unreliable. She's a toddler." This is hearsay through a dog handler. This is absurd. The judge raised his gavel sharply, silencing him. Mr. Stevens, sit down. The objection is noted, but the testimony will stand. His voice was firm, his eyes unyielding. The child is speaking, and this court will listen. For the first time, the toddler lifted her gaze. She didn't look at the lawyers, nor at the judge. She looked straight at the defendant. Her finger rose, small but steady, and pointed directly at him. The silence that followed was unlike anything the courtroom had ever known. Jurors stared, their expressions a mixture of shock and sorrow. Reporters scrambled, their pens scratching furiously as they tried to capture the gravity of the moment. Even the court officials sat frozen, unsure how to breathe, let alone move. The defendant shifted, his face flushed, his hands gripping the table so tightly, his knuckles turned white. His lawyer leaned toward him, whispering frantically, but his composure was already cracking. The little girl turned back to Max, pressing her face into his fur, as though retreating into safety after her act of bravery. Max stayed calm, his steady breathing grounding her as the weight of her words echoed through the courtroom. And just like that, everything had changed. The trial that many had expected to hinge on technicalities, on legal maneuvers, on evidence and objections, now hinged on the voice of a child who had spoken not to the adults, but to a dog. It was the kind of moment that couldn't be scripted, a kind of testimony that no lawyer could anticipate. Pure, unfiltered truth delivered in the only way the child knew how. And though the trial was far from over, though countless arguments and objections lay ahead, everyone in the room understood one thing with absolute certainty. The case would never be the same again. The toddler had spoken, and the courtroom would never forget it. The courtroom sat suspended in a silence so heavy it felt as though even the walls were listening. The little girl's finger had dropped back into her lap, but the impact of her gesture lingered. She had pointed directly at the man accused of hurting her mother. It was a simple act, one that took mere seconds, but its echo reverberated through the hearts of everyone in the room. For a moment, nobody moved. The jury stared at her, their expressions torn between astonishment and empathy. The reporters, who had spent hours preparing summaries and filler stories, suddenly had a headline that was writing itself in real time. Court officials exchanged uneasy glances. Even Judge Henderson, a man seasoned by decades of trials, both large and small, felt the air press down around him. Then, like a dam breaking, the room erupted. Gasps rose from the gallery. The quiet scratching of pens filled the air as journalists frantically recorded what they had just witnessed. The defendant, Raymond Clark, snapped his head toward his lawyer, his face flushed red, his eyes wild with panic. The defense attorney, Mark Stevens, slammed his palm on the table and stood abruptly. "Your Honor." Stevens barked, his voice sharp, slicing through the commotion. This spectacle cannot be permitted to stand. A child 3 years old, whispering to a dog and having her words repeated by a handler. This is not testimony. This is theater. His words carried a sneer, but underneath there was an unmistakable tremor of desperation. The judge rapped his gavel once, twice, until the noise in the courtroom died down. "Mr. Stevens," he said firmly, "this court will decide what constitutes testimony. Sit down." But Stevens wasn't ready to yield. He jabbed a finger toward the witness stand. "She doesn't understand the difference between truth and make-believe. She plays with stuffed animals. She believes in fairy tales. And you're telling me we're going to decide a man's life based on the whispers of a toddler into a dog's ear?" The jurors shifted uncomfortably. His words carried some weight. After all, children that young often lived in worlds of imagination. Could her words be trusted as evidence? Dana Rivers, the prosecutor, rose calmly from her seat. She smoothed the papers in front of her, though she had no intention of using them. This was not a battle that facts and paperwork could win. This was about credibility, about heart, about truth. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady, "we are not asking this jury to convict based solely on a child's words. But what we witnessed just now, what we all witnessed, was not the imagination of a child. It was fear. It was memory. And it was courage. She has not spoken a word to any adult in this room, but she spoke to Max. That, Your Honor, is a truth we cannot ignore." The judge studied the child for a long moment. She was still sitting quietly, stroking Max's fur, her stuffed rabbit lying forgotten at her feet. She seemed oblivious to the storm her words had unleashed. In her world, she had simply confided in a friend. She had no idea that the weight of her whisper might send a man to prison. The judge finally nodded. "Objection overruled. The testimony stands." A hush fell over the courtroom again, but this time it was not disbelief that filled the air. It was tension. The trial had shifted in a single heartbeat. Mark Stevens, though visibly rattled, was not finished. He straightened his suit jacket, masking his unease behind a mask of arrogance. "Very well," he said smoothly, though the edge in his voice betrayed him. "But I intend to cross-examine." The words caused an immediate stir. The idea of cross-examining a toddler sent ripples of discomfort through the room. The jury exchanged uneasy glances, and even the journalists paused, unsure if such a spectacle would be permitted. Dana Rivers was on her feet before he could continue. "Your Honor, I object. Cross-examining a child this young is inappropriate and harmful." The judge's gaze shifted between the two attorneys, then to the little girl. "We will proceed cautiously," he said gravely. "Mr. Stevens, you may ask a limited number of questions, but you will do so with utmost care." Stevens forced a smile, though his eyes betrayed irritation. He approached the stand slowly, almost theatrically, as if trying to intimidate the child. But when he arrived at her side, he found her completely uninterested in him. Her gaze was fixed firmly on Max, her small hand still resting on the dog's back. "Hello," Stevens said in a falsely sweet tone. "You know who I am, don't you?" No response. He tried again. "Do you like stories? Fairy tales?" Still silence. The jury frowned. A few members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing his attempt to manipulate the child. Stevens leaned in closer. "Sometimes little kids imagine things, right? Sometimes you see things that aren't real, like monsters under the bed. Isn't that true?" The toddler finally moved. She pulled Max's ear gently to her lips and whispered again. Daniels, the handler, listened carefully and then repeated her words aloud. "She says, monsters are pretend. Bad man is real." The courtroom erupted in gasps again. Dana Rivers felt her chest tighten with pride. The child had just dismantled Stevens' strategy in the simplest, purest way possible. Stevens' face flushed. He straightened, adjusting his tie, searching for another line of attack. "And how do you know who the bad man is?" He pressed, his voice rising slightly. Again, the child ignored him, leaning into Max. She whispered, her words soft but certain. Daniel's voice carried them to the courtroom. She says, "I saw him." He heard Mommy. "I saw." A wave of emotion surged through the room. Jurors looked visibly shaken. One woman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. A man clenched his jaw, staring hard at the defendant. Stevens knew he was losing ground, but he wasn't finished. Desperation clawed at him. "Children dream. Children get confused," he said quickly, his words tumbling over one another. She could have been coached, influenced, frightened into saying these things. But the damage was done. His voice rang hollow against the raw power of the child's words. The judge leaned forward, his expression stern. "Mr. Stevens, that's enough." Stevens opened his mouth to protest, but the judge's gavel struck sharply. "I said enough." The defense attorney retreated to his table, his composure crumbling, his confidence dimmed. The little girl, meanwhile, had already withdrawn back into her own world. She patted Max's head, humming softly to herself, as though the storm around her had nothing to do with her. In her innocence, she had done the most extraordinary thing. She had cut through layers of argument and doubt with the clarity only a child could bring. The courtroom sat stunned. The jurors now carried her words etched into their hearts. The reporters scribbled madly, crafting lines they knew would make headlines across the nation. And the prosecution sat taller, steadier, knowing that what they had just witnessed was more powerful than any piece of evidence they could have produced. But beneath the surface, tension still lingered. The defense was wounded, but not finished. The trial was far from over, and the little girl's testimony, though powerful, was fragile like glass that could still be shattered if struck hard enough. And so, the silence that followed was not relief. It was not closure. It was anticipation. Everyone in that room, judge, jury, lawyers, and townspeople alike, understood that the story was only beginning. The toddler had spoken, yes, but the echoes of her words would carry through the next chapters of the trial, raising questions, fueling strategies, and pulling every heart deeper into the fight for justice. And as the courtroom sat in uneasy silence, one thought lingered above all. Could such a small voice truly carry the weight of truth in a system built on doubt? Only time would tell. The courtroom had settled into a fragile rhythm after the toddler's first whispered words to Max, the police dog. For some jurors, the idea of weighing the testimony of a 3-year-old remained almost incomprehensible. For others, the child's honesty had already shifted the atmosphere entirely. And for the defendant, Raymond Clark, every heartbeat seemed louder than the last, a relentless reminder of the stakes he now faced. Judge Henderson watched the courtroom carefully. He could sense the undercurrents of tension, a mix of curiosity, doubt, and fear that surrounded this unprecedented moment. While the law demanded fairness, the human element, emotion, compassion, instinct, was taking hold. Every eye was on the child, whose small frame seemed almost impossibly brave in that vast space. Dana Rivers, the prosecutor, knew this was her moment to proceed carefully. She could not rush the toddler, could not pressure her. This wasn't about legal technique. It was about letting the truth emerge naturally. Dana approached the stand slowly, her soft voice carrying reassurance rather than demand. "Do you remember Max?" she asked gently. "He's here to listen to your story, isn't he?" The child's fingers tightened around the dog's collar, and she leaned in, whispering. Her words were soft, but Officer Daniels, the handler, caught every syllable. He repeated them aloud for the courtroom. "She says." "He pushed Mommy." He shouted. The courtroom went still again. The jurors exchanged shocked glances, struggling to process the simplicity and clarity of the toddler's account. She was describing an event most adults would struggle to recall in detail, yet her memory was vivid, unflinching. The defense attorney, Mark Stevens, shifted uneasily in his chair. He knew he had to act fast. Raising his voice, he attempted to undermine the child's testimony. "Objection, Your Honor. This is hearsay. She is a child, barely capable of distinguishing reality from imagination. This is entirely unreliable." Judge Henderson lifted his hand, signaling him to calm down. "Objection noted," he said. "Proceed with caution, Mr. Stevens." But the court recognizes the child's testimony through the handler as admissible. Stevens' eyes narrowed. He had anticipated challenges, but this was unlike anything he had faced. Children could be coached, influenced, or confused. Yet the raw, unfiltered sincerity in her voice, paired with the calm presence of Max, made the courtroom feel airtight around her truth. He decided to pivot. "Let's be clear," he said, turning toward the jury. "This child is speaking only to a dog. How can we possibly take this seriously? We are being asked to convict a man based on the words of a toddler whispered into a canine's ear." The murmurs grew louder. Some jurors nodded. A few glared at him. Even the gallery, filled with townspeople and media, tensed at the audacity of his argument. Yet before he could continue, Dana stepped forward, her voice firm but kind. "The weight of testimony is not measured by the age of the witness, Mr. Stevens. It is measured by truth and observation. This child saw what happened. She is recounting what she witnessed." She paused, letting the statement sink in. Then, with gentle guidance, she directed the child again. "Can you tell Max more about that night? Only to him, just like before?" The child tilted her head, considering. Then she leaned closer to Max, her lips brushing the fur near his ear. "He broke the vase. Mommy, cry. I hide," she whispered. The courtroom froze. Daniels repeated her words aloud. Each syllable cut through the tension, painting a vivid picture of chaos and fear. The jurors scribbled frantically, their faces pale. Witnesses had given statements. Police reports were in evidence, but nothing carried the immediacy and emotional weight that a child's innocent recollection provided. Stephen's jaw tightened. He could feel the case slipping. He tried to reassert control. "Objection. Leading the witness. She is being manipulated. This is dangerous precedent." Judge Henderson rapped his gavel. "Enough. The court finds no manipulation here. The child is recounting events voluntarily, with the assistance of a therapy dog. The testimony is admissible." Stevens muttered under his breath, realizing that his conventional strategies were useless here. The child's words were not rehearsed. They were not coached. They were raw, genuine, and devastatingly direct. The little girl continued, speaking in fragmented sentences that only made the account more poignant. "He, take. Mommy, yell. I." Scared, each phrase carried both innocence and horror. The courtroom collectively held its breath, realizing that the simplest words could communicate the most profound truths. Dana maintained her calm presence, letting the child speak at her own pace. She understood that rushing could shatter the fragile confidence the toddler had found in Max. Every soft phrase, repeated through the handler, became a mosaic of the events that had occurred, a mosaic far more powerful than any forensic report could convey. In the gallery, the audience shifted uneasily. Reporters scribbled notes at a frantic pace, realizing this story would dominate headlines nationwide. Jurors, meanwhile, seemed to be leaning closer in their seats, as if drawn to the toddler's honesty like magnets. Even Stevens could no longer deny the effect her words had on the human hearts around him. But the defense was not finished. Stevens attempted a final strategy. "She could be imagining these things," he said, voice rising in frustration. "Children remember fragments. She could be mistaken. We cannot convict a man on what may be mere imagination." Dana's voice cut through the rising tension, calm yet unwavering. "Children may struggle to articulate with perfect detail, Mr. Stevens, but they see and feel in ways adults sometimes fail to comprehend. She has not told a story to please anyone. She has spoken to Max because she feels safe, and in that safety, the truth has emerged." The judge's eyes softened as he glanced at the child. She was still clutching the dog's collar, humming softly as if the chaos around her could not touch her. In that moment, she was both vulnerable and fearless, a paradox that resonated deeply with everyone watching. Time seemed to stretch in the courtroom. The toddler continued, whispering in bursts, each repeated aloud by Daniels. "He, hit. Table, mommy. Cry, I. Hide. Each fragment became a building block of a story no adult could fabricate convincingly. By now, even some members of the defense team appeared shaken. They had expected an easy target, a fragile child to dismiss. Instead, they were witnessing raw honesty, delivered in the purest form possible, a reminder that truth often comes from the unlikeliest sources. And as the words continued to flow, the entire room became aware of a profound reality. The narrative was no longer controlled by lawyers, strategy, or legal maneuvering. It was controlled by innocence, by trust, and by a little girl who had discovered that her voice could carry power, beyond comprehension so long as she spoke to someone she trusted. The courtroom atmosphere had shifted entirely. Doubt lingered in some corners, but awe and empathy had taken the forefront. Every participant, from jurors to journalists, felt the gravity of what was unfolding. They were witnessing a moment that transcended ordinary legal proceedings, a moment where courage and innocence intertwined, shaking the very foundations of conventional courtroom dynamics. And in the eye of this storm, the toddler remained steadfast. She whispered, leaned on Max, and continued recounting her fragmented but vivid memories. The defense tried and failed to redirect, intimidate, or discredit. The courtroom had learned a new rule that day. Innocence, spoken in trust, could be more powerful than any argument, more compelling than any objection, and far more persuasive than any strategy. By the time Ghana signaled for a brief recess, the entire courtroom was silent, absorbing what had just occurred. Jurors whispered quietly among themselves, reporters stared at their notes in disbelief, and even Stevens sat down with a tense scowl, realizing he had lost control of the narrative. The toddler, oblivious to the storm around her, leaned against Max's side, her small hand stroking his fur. She had spoken. She had revealed pieces of the truth, and in doing so, had changed the entire dynamic of the trial. Outside the courtroom, the media would later call this a miracle of honesty, while the townspeople would remember it as the day a child and a dog silenced an entire courtroom. Inside, those present understood something more profound. The trial was far from over, but the tide had shifted irreversibly. The small voice of a child had begun to carry the weight of justice, and nothing would ever be the same again. After the brief recess, the courtroom atmosphere had shifted. What had started as curiosity and skepticism had transformed into tension, awe, and empathy. Jurors, previously hesitant, now leaned forward in their seats, eyes fixed on the small figure at the witness stand. Reporters, pens poised, recognized that history was being written in front of them. Even the gallery, composed of townspeople, friends, and concerned neighbors, seemed held captive by the fragile courage of a 3-year-old child. The toddler, her hair slightly tousled and her stuffed rabbit forgotten at her feet, had regained her composure beside Max, the police dog. In his presence, she exuded a calm confidence, as if the world around her grown men, shouting lawyers, and buzzing cameras did not exist. Max's steady breathing and unflinching gaze offered a safety the courtroom itself could not provide. Donna Rivers approached once again, careful to maintain a gentle, non-threatening demeanor. She knelt to the child's level, offering reassurance rather than interrogation. "You're doing so well," she said softly. "Do you want to tell Max everything you remember about that night?" The child nodded slowly, her small fingers curling around Max's collar. She leaned close to the dog, whispering again. Officer Daniels, acting as the conduit between innocence and legality, repeated her words aloud for everyone to hear. She says, "He took the vase, threw it. Mommy, cry. I hide under the bed. He yell." The courtroom fell silent once more. Each word was like a brushstroke, painting a vivid scene of fear and danger. Jurors sat motionless, absorbing the child's fragmented but undeniable account. Even reporters found themselves momentarily mute, astonished at the clarity emerging from such a small voice. The defendant shifted uneasily in his chair. Raymond Clark had been confident, almost arrogant, at the start of the trial. But now, with the jury witnessing raw emotion, he grew increasingly tense. His fingers drummed nervously on the table, betraying his inner turmoil. Every whispered detail of his alleged actions was being laid bare in the most unexpected and uncontrollable way, through the eyes and voice of a child. Mark Stevens, the defense attorney, rose quickly, trying to regain control. "Your Honor, again, I object. This is being fed through a dog handler. There is no way to verify accuracy. The child could be confused, mistaken, or influenced." Judge Henderson rapped his gavel firmly, cutting through the chaos. "The objection is noted, Mr. Stevens. The court has already ruled that the child's words, voluntarily spoken to a therapy dog and relayed through the handler, are admissible. Proceed with caution, but the testimony will continue." Stevens sank back into his chair, frustration etched across his face. His usual confidence was unraveling. The child's account was unfolding too naturally, too truthfully, for any conventional defense to counter effectively. Each whispered phrase, though simple and childlike, carried an authenticity that no jury could easily ignore. Dana remained composed, recognizing the delicate balance. She couldn't push too hard or risk overwhelming the child, yet she needed every detail. Carefully, she encouraged the toddler to continue. "Can you tell Max about the place where you were hiding?" The child's eyes widened slightly. She took a deep breath, as if preparing to traverse memories too frightening to revisit. Then, with small but determined words, she whispered, "She hide under bed. Hear him. Shout, Mommy." Scared, Officer Daniels repeated the words aloud. The jury leaned forward in their seats. Murmurs of shock rippled through the gallery. For the first time, the little girl's testimony was not just startling, it was undeniable. She was providing a chronological sequence of events that matched the evidence already collected by investigators. Yet it came from a source that no one could have anticipated. The emotional impact on the courtroom was palpable. One juror dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Another leaned back, staring at the ceiling, as though trying to process the juxtaposition of innocence and horror. Even some members of the gallery whispered among themselves, stunned that a toddler could communicate the truth in such a profound way. Dana paused, giving the child a moment to rest and feel supported. "You're doing so well," she whispered. "Max is here. You can tell him anything, and he will keep listening." The toddler's small shoulders relaxed, and she continued. "He push. Mommy. Scream. I hug Max." Every phrase reinforced the credibility of her account. Jurors were no longer questioning the validity of her words. They were feeling them. They could visualize the room where the incident had occurred, imagine the fear of the mother, and sense the courage it had taken for this child to witness such events firsthand. The defense attorney's attempts to object were growing increasingly desperate. Stevens attempted another line of attack. The child could be repeating something she overheard. She may have been influenced by adults. This is not reliable testimony. Dana responded calmly, allowing the child to continue without interruption. The calm, measured demeanor contrasted sharply with Stevens' frustration, making the disparity between truth and doubt all the more evident. And then, something remarkable happened. The little girl paused, glanced briefly at the judge, then back at Max, and whispered one final phrase. "He take my rabbit. I cry. Mommy, help." The courtroom collectively held its breath. The stuffed rabbit, now lying on the floor, became a symbol of innocence disrupted. Every eye focused on the small figure, her voice conveying both terror and bravery. The raw emotion of her testimony moved the audience in ways no legal argument could. At that moment, the prosecution realized they had reached a breakthrough. The child's words were no longer just a fragmentary account. They were a full narrative, revealing details that aligned perfectly with the physical evidence. Every object knocked over, every cry, every frightened movement was now documented through her testimony. Judge Henderson, witnessing the delicate balance of fear and courage in the child, nodded slightly. He allowed the testimony to continue, recognizing the profound importance of this unprecedented moment. Outside the witness stand, Dana's colleagues exchanged glances. The prosecution had managed to harness the most extraordinary form of evidence. Unfiltered, truthful, and compelling testimony from someone too young to understand legal strategy, but old enough to have witnessed injustice. The defendant's composure was crumbling. His face was pale, and his hands shook as he gripped the edge of the table. Every whispered word from the child struck like a hammer, each phrase dismantling his carefully constructed defenses. The reality was undeniable. The court was witnessing truth, pure and unvarnished, communicated in the only way she could express it, with trust in her loyal companion. Max. By the end of the session, the child had shared more than anyone could have anticipated. She had provided a clear and detailed sequence of events, each statement revealing both fear and courage. The jury, witnesses, and spectators were left deeply moved, fully aware that this testimony had shifted the trial's momentum. For Dana Rivers, the breakthrough was clear. The child's voice had changed the trajectory of the trial. The prosecution now had an irrefutable account from a witness whose innocence could not be fabricated, whose observations were undeniable, and whose courage inspired everyone present. Even Mark Stevens, once confident, now sat back, his face pale and his mind racing for any strategy that could mitigate the damage. But it was too late. The courtroom had witnessed a moment of extraordinary honesty, and the narrative was no longer in his control. And as the session ended, and the child was escorted from the stand, Max following obediently, everyone in the courtroom understood the profound significance of what had just occurred. This was not merely testimony, it was a testament to the power of innocence, trust, and courage. The trial was far from over, but the breakthrough had been made. Justice, fragile and complex, now had a voice that could not be ignored. And in the eyes of everyone present, it was clear. This little girl, through whispers to a dog, had already left an indelible mark on the courtroom, and perhaps on the history of child testimony in America. The courtroom was electric with anticipation. Every person present knew that the trial had reached a critical point. The little girl's testimony, delivered in fragments to Max, the police dog, had already captured hearts and shifted momentum. But now, the prosecution intended to dig deeper, gently coaxing the truth from the child without forcing her into fear. Dana Rivers approached the stand again, her face calm but determined. She knelt beside the toddler, speaking in a quiet voice only the girl could hear. "You're doing so well. Max is listening. Can you tell him what happened right before Mommy got hurt?" The child paused, glancing at the judge briefly, then at Max, who looked back patiently. Her tiny fingers gripped the dog's fur, and she leaned close. Her whisper was almost imperceptible, but Officer Daniels caught every word. He repeated it aloud, careful and precise. She says, "He took the vase. He yell, Mommy. Cry. I scared, hide." The room went silent. Every juror leaned forward, captivated. Reporters scribbled furiously, realizing that the sequence of events, as described by the toddler, aligned perfectly with the forensic evidence gathered by investigators. Raymond Clark's hands tightened around the table. He had been tense for hours, but now his face was pale, his composure slipping. He opened his mouth to object, but Stevens waved him down, whispering frantically. The defense lawyer's usual confidence was gone, replaced by a quiet panic. Stevens stood abruptly, trying to regain control. "Your Honor, this is preposterous. The child is speaking to a dog. This is not testimony in any conventional sense. There is no way to verify these statements." Judge Henderson, his eyes sharp, tapped his gavel. "Objection noted, Mr. Stevens. The court has already ruled on the admissibility of this testimony. Proceed with caution, but the child will continue." Stevens sank back into his chair, visibly frustrated. He knew that the jury was no longer questioning the credibility of the child. Her innocence, combined with Max's steady presence, made her words powerful beyond argument. Every whispered phrase carried undeniable truth. A child leaned closer to Max, whispering again. Daniels repeated her words for the courtroom. She says, "He, push. Mommy, table. I hide under bed. He yell very loud." The jurors' faces reflected the impact. One woman dabbed her eyes. A man clenched his jaw, staring directly at the defendant. The gallery was silent, hanging on every detail. Even seasoned reporters struggled to capture the emotional weight of the moment. Dinah's voice, soft and encouraging, guided the child further. "Can you tell Max what you did after you hid?" The little girl's eyes welled with tears. She whispered, her voice trembling but determined. "She. Call police. Mommy hurt I." Scared. Gasps echoed across the courtroom. The narrative had reached a pivotal point. The child had not only witnessed the abuse, but had also acted bravely, alerting authorities. Her testimony was no longer just recollection. It was evidence of courage and initiative, a direct account that would be impossible for the defense to discredit entirely. Stevens tried again, his voice cracking slightly. "Objection. This is entirely speculative. A child's understanding is limited. How can we trust what she says about calling the police?" Judge Henderson tapped the gavel again. "Sit down, Mr. Stevens. The objection is overruled." Even as the defense fumbled for control, the courtroom had shifted irreversibly. The child's simple, brave words were shaping the narrative with clarity that no legal maneuver could undo. Each whispered detail confirmed what investigators had reported and what witnesses had feared. The toddler's next phrase sent a chill through the courtroom. Daniels repeated it carefully. "She saw him take Mommy's phone. Hide. Angry. I. Scared." The weight of these words sank into every listener. The child was recounting not just physical abuse, but moments of manipulation and fear, actions that demonstrated a pattern of control and intimidation. The prosecution now had testimony that no amount of defense strategy could easily counter. Even the jury seemed overwhelmed by the clarity. The child's narrative, delivered in short, innocent phrases, created a vivid picture of the events that had unfolded in the home. The combination of courage, observation, and untainted perspective made her testimony undeniable. Dana gave a small, reassuring nod to the toddler. "You're doing so well. Max is proud of you. Can you tell him what happened next?" The child's hands trembled slightly as she whispered, Daniels repeating, "She, Mommy fall, hey. Yell, I, run, call. Police." At that moment, the courtroom became fully aware of the gravity of the situation. The child had witnessed real violence and had acted to protect her mother. Her testimony, though delivered in fragmented words to a dog, was powerful evidence of both the defendant's actions and the child's bravery. Raymond Clark's face was now ashen. He leaned back in his chair, trying to maintain composure, but the cracks were evident. Every juror, every member of the gallery, could see the impact of her words. There was no denying the reality she had conveyed. Stevens, realizing the tide had turned irreversibly, made a final desperate attempt. "Your Honor, the child's testimony, this is unprecedented. A 3-year-old speaking to a dog. It is inadmissible. This cannot determine a man's fate." Judge Henderson's gavel struck sharply. "Enough, the court has ruled. The testimony is admissible and continues. Mr. Stevens, you may sit." The room was silent once more, save for the soft sounds of Max shifting slightly under the child's touch. The little girl leaned closer, whispering her final words. "She hurt. Mommy, I scared. Call. Police help." Every word resonated like a hammer striking steel. The jury, the gallery, the lawyers, and even the court staff felt the weight of her courage. The narrative was clear, coherent, and undeniable. The child had done something extraordinary. She had conveyed the truth in its rawest form, untouched by strategy, unaffected by adult expectations. Dana Rivers looked around the courtroom, her voice steady but filled with reverence. "Your Honor, the child has provided a full account of her observations. She has acted bravely and truthfully. I ask the court and jury to consider the weight of courage and honesty, beyond age, beyond fear, as evidence in this case." Judge Henderson nodded solemnly. "So noted. The court recognizes the significance of the testimony provided and commends the child's bravery." The toddler, having completed her account, finally released her grip on Max and leaned back. Her small face was streaked with tears, yet her eyes held a quiet pride. She had spoken. She had faced the room full of adults, and she had told the truth in the only way she could, through trust in her loyal companion. The courtroom seemed to exhale as if a collective weight had lifted. The trial was far from over, but the climax of emotional truth had arrived. The jury, deeply affected, would carry this testimony forward into deliberation. The gallery would never forget the bravery of a child. Even the media outside would report it as a moment that transcended ordinary courtroom proceedings. For Raymond Clark, the moment was devastating. For Dana Rivers, it was the breakthrough she had hoped for. And for the child, it was simply the right thing to do, tell the truth, and let justice follow. In the stillness that followed, everyone understood the profound reality. The courtroom had witnessed an extraordinary act of courage, the kind that reminded every adult present of the power of innocence, honesty, and trust. And though the trial continued, that day, the small voice of a toddler had already changed everything. The courtroom was quiet, yet the air remained thick with tension. The toddler's testimony had ended, but its weight lingered like an invisible storm. Every juror sat in stunned silence, struggling to reconcile the innocence of her words with the gravity of what they revealed. Even those who had been skeptical now found themselves deeply moved. Dana Rivers, sensing the moment of pause, allowed the courtroom a few breaths to absorb the events. She did not rush, knowing that rushing could undermine the emotional impact that was naturally unfolding. Her eyes briefly met the child's. The little girl, sitting beside Max, hugged her stuffed rabbit to her chest. She was exhausted from the bravery it had taken to speak, yet proud of herself in the quiet, honest way only a child could be. Across the room, Raymond Clark sat slumped in his chair. His hands were clenched, his jaw tight, his mind racing through every possible legal maneuver that could possibly save him. Mark Stevens, his defense attorney, leaned close, whispering strategies with a growing desperation. But the subtle shift in the courtroom was undeniable. The tide had turned irreversibly against them. "Your Honor," Stevens finally stood, his voice tense but calculated. "We request a recess to reconsider our approach. This testimony, as unconventional as it is, has been highly prejudicial. We need time to formulate our next step." Judge Henderson regarded him carefully, his eyes narrowing slightly. The court grants a brief recess. But let it be clear, the testimony provided voluntarily and courageously stands. You will have no opportunity to manipulate or intimidate the child further. The court values the integrity of her account. As the lawyers stepped aside, the jurors whispered quietly among themselves, their conversations low but intense. Many admitted they had never encountered such a case, where the primary witness was a toddler speaking to a dog. Yet the clarity, honesty, and emotional power of her words were undeniable. Some jurors even confessed to feeling tears welling in their eyes, realizing that this child's courage had transcended the courtroom into something profoundly human. In the gallery, the townspeople spoke in hushed tones. Many had come to witness justice for the family involved, but none expected to see such a display of bravery and truth from a child so young. The media scribbled notes feverishly, their pens struggling to capture not just the facts of the case, but the emotional resonance. Headlines were already forming in their minds. Toddler's whisper shakes court. Bravery and innocence prevail in courtroom drama. Child speaks. Dog listens, truth emerges. Dana Rivers approached the toddler, crouching to offer gentle reassurance. You did something very brave today, she whispered softly. You told Max what happened. That was all you needed to do, and you did it perfectly. The child nodded slightly, still clinging to Max's collar. Her small voice broke through the quiet. Max, help Mommy. Safe. The simple words, spoken with childlike clarity, struck everyone present with new force. Max thumped his tail softly, as if acknowledging the toddler's bravery and reinforcing the bond that had become the centerpiece of the trial. Back at the defense table, Stevens was visibly running out of options. We can't attack the child without appearing callous, he whispered. Every time we object, every attempt to undermine her, the jury sees it as cruelty. They will side with her. Clark, pale and shaken, finally spoke, his voice almost inaudible. I didn't? Stevens placed a hand on his client's arm, restraining him. Not now. Let's wait and see. We have to focus on procedural defenses. As the brief recess ended, the courtroom reconvened. The tension was almost unbearable. Every juror seemed attuned to the smallest sound, every movement of the child and Max, every expression of the lawyers. The trial had become less about abstract legal arguments and more about human emotion and courage. Dana called the child back to the stand for final clarifications. Can you tell Max if anything else happened that night? She asked, her voice gentle. The toddler took a deep breath, then whispered once more. Officer Daniels repeated her words. Take Mommy. Hurt, hide, call. Police help. The jury absorbed the testimony, each word reinforcing the sequence of events they had already visualized. The clarity of the narrative, combined with the child's courage, created an undeniable force in the courtroom. No technical objection, no legal argument could erase the simplicity and power of what had been conveyed. Stevens made a final attempt to argue procedural issues, questioning whether the child's age and method of communication with Max compromised the validity of her account. But every word he spoke seemed hollow against the weight of truth. The jury's faces reflected empathy, understanding, and increasingly, certainty that the defendant's guilt could no longer be denied. Outside the courtroom, the public had begun to gather, sensing the extraordinary nature of the trial. News crews prepared cameras, reporters drafted copy, and the small town itself seemed gripped by the tale unfolding inside. The story was no longer just legal. It had become a cultural phenomenon, highlighting courage, trust, and the profound bond between a child and her protector. Back inside, the little girl finally relaxed, her tiny frame leaning into Max's side. She had delivered her testimony, faced the courtroom, and in doing so, shifted the course of the trial. Dana Rivers allowed her a small smile, acknowledging her bravery without fanfare. Judge Henderson looked over the proceedings, his gavel resting lightly on the desk. He understood that the case would now rely not just on additional evidence, but on the emotional and moral clarity the child had provided. The innocence of her words, amplified by the unwavering presence of Max, had changed the courtroom forever. As the session drew to a close for the day, the jury was dismissed to consider the weight of what they had heard. Jurors whispered among themselves, their conversations a mix of astonishment and reflection. Many remarked that no argument, no testimony from adults, could have been as compelling as the simple, truthful words of a child who trusted only a dog to convey what she had witnessed. The gallery slowly emptied, each person carrying with them the memory of a small figure whose courage had transcended age, fear, and circumstance. The media outside buzzed with speculation and admiration, ready to tell the story of a toddler whose bravery had shaken a courtroom to its very core. Inside, the child hugged Max one last time, whispering softly, "We safe." Now, Max thumped his tail in response, a silent promise that her bravery had not gone unnoticed. For Raymond Clark, the day had been a disaster. For Dana Rivers and the prosecution, it was a pivotal breakthrough. And for the toddler, it was simply the completion of a task she had instinctively known was right. Tell the truth and let justice find its way. As the courtroom emptied, Judge Henderson remained seated, reflecting on the unprecedented events. The trial had already become historic, not for legal precedent alone, but for the courage, honesty, and human spirit displayed in every whispered word between a child and a dog. And while the verdict still lay ahead, the outcome now seemed inexorably tied to the small voice that had spoken the truth without fear, forever changing the course of the trial and the hearts of all who had witnessed it. The courtroom was hushed as the jury filed back in after hours of deliberation. Every person in the room could feel the weight of the moment, the culmination of weeks of testimony, evidence, and most unusually, the courageous words of a 3-year-old child whispered to a police dog. The energy was tense, yet charged with anticipation. Judge Henderson called the courtroom to order. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" he asked. The foreperson, a woman in her late 40s, stood, her hands trembling slightly. She cleared her throat and nodded to the others. "Yes, Your Honor, we have." The courtroom leaned forward collectively. Reporters held their pens in midair. Spectators, townspeople, and family members waited with bated breath. The small toddler, now sitting beside Max, sensed the gravity in the room. Though she was too young to understand the technicalities, she instinctively knew that her whispers had changed everything. The foreperson's voice was steady but solemn. "We, the jury, find the defendant Raymond Clark guilty on all counts of abuse and endangerment." A collective gasp swept through the room. Some wept openly. Others sat frozen, stunned by the weight of justice being served. Tears filled the eyes of the mother, who had silently endured weeks of anxiety, hoping that truth would prevail. She clutched her daughter tightly, grateful beyond words for the child's bravery. Clark's face went pale. He slumped in his chair, disbelief etched across every line of his face. Mark Stevens leaned over to whisper, but even he seemed unable to offer solace. The courtroom had rejected his attempts at manipulation, intimidation, and conventional legal tactics. The jury's decision reflected a clarity that only innocence and truth could achieve. The judge's gavel struck the desk. The court acknowledges the jury's verdict. This courtroom commends the courage displayed by the primary witness, whose testimony has proven to be both brave and truthful. A soft murmur of admiration filled the gallery. The townspeople, reporters, and legal observers recognized that what they had witnessed was historic not for precedent alone, but for the remarkable power of honesty and courage displayed in its purest form. Dana Rivers approached the mother and child carefully. "You did it," she said softly. "Your daughter helped make this right. She was brave beyond measure." The mother's eyes glistened. I can't thank you enough," she whispered. She hugged her daughter, who clung to Max, stroking his fur with quiet pride. The little girl's simple smile said more than words ever could. She had done what many adults could not. She had told the truth, and it had been heard. Outside the courtroom, the media erupted. Cameras flashed, microphones captured quotes, and headlines formed almost instantly. Toddler's courageous testimony leads to justice. Child and police dog silence a courtroom. Innocence and bravery prevail. The story spread rapidly, capturing hearts across the nation. People marveled at the power of a small voice, amplified by trust and innocence, to effect real change. Back inside, the courtroom slowly emptied, leaving only the family, the prosecution, and a few staff members. Max trotted loyally beside the child, who hummed softly, a sound of contentment after days of tension and fear. The mother held her close, whispering words of love and relief. Judge Henderson took a moment before adjourning the court. "Let this day serve as a reminder," he said, "that courage comes in all forms and all ages. Justice, when guided by truth, need not wait for eloquence or adulthood. Sometimes it speaks through the simplest and bravest hearts." The words resonated deeply. Everyone in the room felt them, not as a statement of law, but as a statement of humanity. The trial had been unusual, extraordinary, and even unprecedented, yet it highlighted a truth that transcended legal boundaries. Honesty and courage could triumph in the face of fear. Stevens and Clark exited quietly, the weight of the verdict pressing upon them. The former was already calculating appeals, procedural maneuvers, and legal strategies, but even he could not erase the moral clarity the courtroom had witnessed. Clark, on the other hand, faced the consequences of his actions, stripped of defenses and confronted by the undeniable reality of his wrongdoing. For the mother and child, the day marked a turning point. Life would never return to the uncertainty and fear of the past. The courtroom had not only delivered justice, but also affirmed the bravery and innocence of a child whose trust in a dog had allowed her to speak freely. In those whispered words, the truth had emerged unshaken, uncompromised, and ultimately victorious. Over the following weeks, the story gained national attention. Articles, news segments, and social media posts celebrated the extraordinary bond between the toddler and Max, the police dog. Experts spoke about the importance of child testimony, the role of therapy animals in legal proceedings, and the remarkable psychological insight shown by the child. Many children's advocacy groups cited the case as a historic example of empowerment and courage. At home, life slowly returned to normal. The little girl played in her backyard, with Max always nearby, her laughter ringing clear and free. Her mother watched, heart full, knowing that the nightmare of abuse had ended, and that her daughter's bravery had been a beacon of hope for everyone involved. Dana Rivers reflected on the trial as well. She knew she had witnessed something extraordinary, a courtroom transformed by innocence, a small voice that carried more weight than arguments, legal maneuvers, or technicalities. The child's bravery had reminded everyone, professionals and lay people alike, that justice could be guided by the simplest truths and the most courageous hearts. As weeks turned into months, the case continued to inspire discussions, articles, and even seminars for law enforcement and child advocacy professionals. Max was honored at a community ceremony for his role in the trial, recognized not just as a police dog, but as a confidant and protector who had enabled the child to share her story without fear. And through it all, The toddler's voice remained small but powerful, a reminder that even the youngest among us can wield truth as a force strong enough to change lives, alter judgments, and deliver justice. Her whispers to Max had become a symbol of courage, resilience, and the extraordinary power of innocence in a complex world. Years later, those present at the trial would remember that day vividly. The courtroom, once a place of tension, doubt, and fear, had been transformed by a child and her dog. Their story became a legend in the small town, and a testament to the enduring power of honesty. In the quiet of her home, the little girl would sometimes hug Max tightly and whisper softly, "We did it. We helped Mommy." And in that small, simple declaration, she captured the essence of everything that had transpired: courage, truth, and the profound, undeniable impact of one small voice in a world that often overlooked innocence. Justice had been served. Hearts had been touched. And the echoes of a toddler's whispers, carried by the unwavering presence of a loyal dog, would resonate far beyond the walls of the courtroom for generations to come.